we are in the early stages of this season's Fresh Identity, and today I want to address a subject that is a little bit uncomfortable. It is to ask yourself the questions before you enter any of those containers, whether you have the capacity for growth. Not just the desire for it, but the capacity for it. Let me explain. You may want to go through a particular phase of healing or growth in your life. That's why you want to find the right support, the right format, the right therapist, the right guide. That's wonderful. And sure enough, the desire for growth is where it all starts. You have to want to change for it to even happen. However, it is not sufficient to just want it. You have to ask yourself whether you have the capacity for it. What does that mean? Do you have the time? Do you have the energy? These questions are important because healing, therapy, coaching does not happen in a vacuum. You are not in a bubble for the 3 months of the Fresh Identity program, for example, where you can just look after yourself and your needs. That is lovely when you have the possibility to do that in your life, but that is very rare. You are rarely in a retreat for such a long period of time. Generally, you have to interweave your therapy or your coaching sessions with everyday life. So you have to step into your sessions, but then come back to being a mum, being a worker, being a spouse, having to look after your parents, your neighbor, your activities, your life. And if you're maxed out with that, it is not really realistic to think that you will have enough headspace to look after your own needs. It's really important to be realistic about what you can dedicate to your growth, because otherwise you are not giving yourself the best chances. Now, let me flip it on its head for a minute. It doesn't mean to say that there is ever a situation where everything is perfect for you to have enough time and even enough space, to get everything in a line for your growth, to have all the leisurely space to expand. That doesn't work either. I appreciate that. But there is a balance to be found. If you have literally no time in your diary, then you will find it very difficult to dedicate time, not just for the sessions, but in the case of Fresh Identity, for the times in between, the reflection time, the journaling time. If practically you look at your diary before you even enter into a program and you cannot at least dedicate, in our case, the hour for the fortnightly session, but also at least another hour in the weeks in between, and I would say probably another hour somewhere in the week, so say 2 hours a week at least for yourself, somehow, in whichever form that takes, then you're probably going to find it very difficult to really give your growth and your healing intentions some proper airtime. And then it's not just a question of diary, it's also how much headspace you have. So if you are in a situation where you're dealing with bereavement recently, or whether you're dealing with major issues of ill health for yourself or for your loved ones, if things at work are especially intense, whatever the reason, you've got to ask, can you even switch off for long enough to look after you? It's important that you ask yourself these questions before you enter those programs like Fresh Identity, because otherwise you might have a disconnect between the desire for growth and the reality of what you can give it. Now, I don't want you to mishear me. It doesn't mean that, excuse me, it doesn't mean that it's impossible, because you might look at it and say, Alban, that's great, but there is never a time in my life where I can have enough headspace and so on, and I've got to squeeze it in, I've got to make it happen. That's fair enough. But you've got to find that balance point for yourself. Often what I find happens is that the desire for growth can really make things happen, because you are so uncomfortable with whatever your situation is that you really want to change, and therefore you make it happen. You give it time in your diary, you give it the headspace that is needed, and that's fair enough. But I just want you to think cautiously before you enter Fresh Identity or any other program, it's not just mine, that you ask yourself how much you can truly dedicate to it. It is important to start with the desire for growth, but it is not sufficient. You have to also have the space for it, the time for it, the capacity for growth.